Although Old English as a language predates it, Old English literature really properly begins with Caedmon's hymn. And the fascinating thing about Caedmon's hymn is we know how it was made. We're given the account of it from the Venerable Bede. And he tells us in the Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation that Caedmon is this illiterate cowherd who previously had shown no musical talent, no talent with poetry, nothing like this. And one day, God miraculously gives him the gift of being able to compose in Old English. And this is where Caedmon's hymn comes from. Not only is Caedmon's hymn interesting because we know about how it was composed, but it's also this model of Old English literature. So let me read for you the entirety of Caedmon's hymn in Old English. And when you're listening to it, listen for the sounds of the language, how English sounded back when it was closer to that Germanic origin. Nu schulan herian, heaven riches word, methodes merchtandes modje thank, welk wodor fada swahe wunje hewes, et jedrikten or anstelde, he adeshop, ilde bernum, heaven rova halli shippend, tha middenjerd man kunnesweld, et jedrikten after theode, virum volden, freya allmigde. Now, not only does that have a very different sound from modern English, but if you look at Caedmon's hymn, you'll see that there are even some letters in there that don't survive into modern English. Some of the sounds are different. Some sounds that we might use in modern English aren't used in Old English. Some sounds that we don't have are. But what's interesting is when you look at Caedmon's hymn, you'll very often see how it's represented on the page in what are called half lines. Nu shallan herian heaven reaches word. And so when Old English is translated, it very often has this kind of broken, wiggy sound to it. Bum, 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 bum. And so sometimes it seems like there are a lot of sentence fragments. The reason for this is, like many writers of poetry who were not literate, the way that poetry was often composed was through use of what are called oral formulas. Little tiny snippets of language that you can tack on to other parts of language to make entire lines of poetry, and this helps a poet who can't read remember the line. Now, there are two different types of poetry, basically. Poems that work off of rhyme and poems that work off of alliteration. And rhyme is where the last sound, usually at the end of a word or end of a line, is the same sound. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. And you have the rhyme by the sound of the last line. Alliterative poetry has the first sound of a word repeats, and usually within the same line. And if you get a lot of alliteration, it starts to sound kind of ridiculous. So a lot of tongue twisters in modern English start off use alliteration. So Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That is alliterative. Now that's way too much alliteration, and it becomes a tongue twister. Now what happens in Old English poetry is every line of poetry is divided into two lines, and the first half line establishes the alliterative pattern, and the second half line fulfills that alliterative pattern. So, for example, Nu shulan herian, the herian establishes it, and so in the second half line there has to be an H sound, and again, indeed it starts with it. Hefon riches word. Okay, listen to the next line. Methodes merkten. Okay, there is no room to choose it here. Both words in the beginning of the first line start with the M sound. So you know that you have to have an M sound in the second half. And his modje thank. So what would happen is a poet who didn't have it written down could remember a poem, because if they remember the first half line, they know the second half line must in some way alliterate off of that. And it must repeat one of the sounds that comes from before it, and it really helps them to remember it. The reason Caedmon's hymn, then, works as such a beautiful starting place is that it offers first a model for how Old English poetry would have been composed, and how illiterate poets like Caedmon might have been able to remember long stretches of poetry and to come up with long stretches of poetry. But also, it offers a suggestion that Old English literature, that the beginnings of English literature are ultimately divine, and that is a gift from God.